Big Seance Podcast, Episode 82. The 2016 search terms that brought people to BigSeance.com.
Welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Happy New Year, Paranerds. It's been a little quiet here in the parlor lately, and I won't apologize because as I look back this time last year, I think I took a little extra break then too, and so I probably should just put a break in the schedule for the future. So we're a little late for an episode, but it's a new year, and just like a lot of things, you know, we'll be getting back on track soon. So here's what's going to happen today. It's a solo episode with just moi, so no guest. However, I, of course, have a spectacular spectral edition from Tim Prossel a little later. But we're going to be talking about some of the search terms that brought people to BigSeance.com throughout the year of 2016. I'm also going to give you 9 tips to keeping the paranormal alive in your life throughout the winter. So let's get started. Maybe we should pour the tea just for fun. Let's pour the tea. Doesn't that just make you feel warm and cozy? So here's the deal. WordPress is really good with stats. And one of the stats that I find the coolest is the search terms that you can look up. You can look up search terms throughout the whole entire life of BigSeance.com. And just so you know, it takes a couple of hours just to go through the search terms for any given year. And so, you know, what you're going to hear today are very much just some highlights that I've pointed out. But some of them are obvious. Some of them are expected. You know, many of them are very similar to each other. You know, you can think of any topic that I've podcasted about or blogged about, and all of those words are going to be in the search terms. But there are some fascinating ones, and some that are funny and unexpected, and some that you wonder, how in the world did that lead that person to BigSeance.com? But some are just interesting and kind of inspire us to chat a little bit about some of these things. For example, Victorian iron fencing. That brought people to BigSeance.com in 2016. And iron fencing, especially Victorian, I think about some of the old homes in my hometown of Lexington and the fencing that still surrounds some of those homes and how old it must be. But also in cemeteries. I have a lot of photography from cemeteries, and I love the fencing around some of the plots and things, just the old iron fencing that, you know, has the lichens, is that how you say it, on the fence? You know, kind of moldy looking. Anyway, I have a lot of those photos on Flickr. Seance Trumpet. You know, I blogged several years ago about what I thought was a seance trumpet. At the time, I found it at an antique store, and I took a few pictures of it, and I was doing some research on it and almost went back to get what I was thinking was a seance trumpet, and it turned out to be a boat horn from a boat. So still very antique, very cool, but it wasn't a seance trumpet. So I'm still looking for a legitimate antique seance trumpet. And I know you can still get seance trumpets and they're, new. That's not interesting to me. I want an old one. So there's a search term that I thought was interesting, how to obtain bilocation. And that made me think of Randy Keller, my cuz, and our bilocation experiments. And by the way, he's still doing bilocation experiments. Can a spirit be in two places at the same time? Or I like to also think at least travel very fast, because that to me is just as fascinating as being in two places at the same time. I've lumped some together here, and these, could cause some goosebumps, I'm sure, or freak some people out. But it makes you wonder, when people type in these search terms, I'm assuming that probably they're experiencing some of these things, which has caused them to type whatever search term they typed in Google. But here's some: presence in the middle of the night, racing heart on waking. I woke up to a melody in my head. That one, actually, I could tell you probably right now what post that they got directed to on that one. I woke up. I've actually had a couple of dreams where I woke up with an original melody in my head, or at least a melody that I have never heard in my life that I'm aware of, singing it in my head, and it came from my dream. Waking up and feeling a negative presence. Spirit visit while sleeping. And then what visits me at night? So, if someone's desperate to find answers, it kind of breaks your heart a little bit if you're turning to Google and saying, what visits me at night? But there you go. Apparently people do it, and it takes them to bigseance.com. Flies in demonic hauntings. There are a lot of similar search terms like this one that I see on my report. And I really don't think this is a thing. Andrea Perrin, who wrote about this in her trilogy, she's the eldest daughter of the Conjuring family from that true story. And she wrote a trilogy about those experiences. And there's quite a bit about some situations that they had in the house with flies. It's certainly a popular concept for movies also, but I'm not so sure about that one. This one's interesting because I can totally relate to it. Insight around EVP burnout. I think this is real, and I think I'm going to Google this one myself, actually, to see if there's other information about the topic. Maybe there are others like me out there. I definitely experienced some EVP burnout, mainly because of the time that I was committing to it and how much time it takes to just sit in front of an audio editor and listen to, depending on how you're experimenting or what you're doing, but hours of just nothing but, like white noise or silence. And you kind of go a little crazy. And, as I'm so very skeptical, that 50% of my brain that likes to fight my other side of my brain. And I think I just got tired of fighting myself, fighting the skeptic part of my brain. And it seemed kind of pointless to me. So I still do some EVP every now and then, but certainly not as heavy as I was. But I do think that this burnout, paranormal burnout in general, I think it's a thing. Lobotomy at Danvers State. Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts was built in 1874. It's where they filmed a really cool movie called Session 9. And what's really interesting about this place is, I don't remember what year, but it's now a giant apartment complex that has a similar architectural style of the hospital. Most of the original structures are gone, but the original center structure is still there, and it's just remodeled. And they built a whole bunch of apartment units and buildings around it. And it's still a massive looking place, but I'd love to go inside and see that place. And it makes you wonder, could there still be activity there at Danvers State Hospital? You should check that out if you haven't really looked at it. But that's a good movie too. Check out the movie Session 9. Illinois law for disclosure on stigmatized properties. I looked this one up. Murders, suicides, hauntings, those things are not required to be disclosed in Illinois for like real estate documents. Meth labs are the big thing now. That would be a giant check mark there. But apparently it's just how it is in most states. Hauntings and, murders and suicides aren't really required to be documented. Apparently it's a good idea and recommended, but not required. I'm not sure how you would prove some of those things, at least the hauntings part. Opera House in Carthage, Missouri. I was fortunate enough to be able to investigate the Opera House in Carthage, Missouri a few years ago with the Joplin Paranormal Research Society. Anyway, it's one of the few places I can actually say I investigated before TAPS and Ghost Hunters did. They had a pretty good episode there last year, though. You should check that out, but it's a really cool place. I think some of the team members that I investigated with caught some singing, and one of the things that the Ghost Hunters captured, I think, was singing or music of some kind too. So that correlated. Pretty cool. Celebrities who seance. I just love the sound of that one. It sounds so fancy. Celebrities who seance. Hearing music in your dreams. That's similar to the one we read earlier. Several search terms were on the list this year about McPike Mansion in Alton, Illinois. And I was able to do a brief tour around the you can go in the basement of the McPike Mansion nowadays. You can walk around, but they've been on a really, really slow journey of refurbishing, remodeling McPike. And I had a chance to talk to one of the owners of McPike this last summer. It was a really cool conversation, but the place is really starting to shape up. If you Google images of it and see what it used to look like and what it's looking like now, it looks really cool. You still can't go inside, at least public, that I'm aware of, unless people get in there illegally, which wouldn't be good. But I can't wait till it's completely repaired and be able to go in. Beautiful building. Destructive witchcraft spirits in Missouri. I just wonder about that. I have no clue what that really is, looking for. Destructive witchcraft spirits in Missouri. Union Screaming House. There were several search terms looking for information on the Union Screaming House. I've never been to this house, which is in Union, Missouri. Not super far from here. I've been to Union a couple of times. But I've read a great book about the Union Screaming House. It's called The Uninvited, The True Story of the Union Screaming House. It's by Stephen LaChance. And that title is not to be confused with the great black and white movie that I've talked about a few times of the same name. It's also called The Uninvited. But this is a book, different house, but true story. And apparently a lot of people are really interested in the Union Screaming House. Composer participating in seances. And I really think this is probably regarding, there's a musical out based on a movie called Seance on a Wet Afternoon. The movie, I think, was made in the 60s. And I actually have the YouTube pulled up right here on my computer, and I think I'm going to watch it later. I haven't seen it before, and I've heard about this several times, and I just keep putting it off. But I think I'm going to check it out. But apparently, there's now a musical. I don't know if it's off Broadway or where it is, but Seance on a Wet Afternoon. So I can only assume that's what composer participating in seances meant, but maybe not. I don't know. I could just be making that up. These two popped up again this year. They popped up last year, and I think it's funny. Ice skating dinosaur, and then dinosaur figure skating. I'm not sure why they pop up. I had a dream that I blogged about where a dinosaur was figure skating, and it was like a movie, and there was a song and a melody that I woke up remembering, and I talked about this earlier. That's where, I guess that's why there are several other search terms about songs and dreams that direct people to me as well. But seriously, how often do people need to Google dinosaur figure skating? And why? And maybe there's some pop culture thing that I'm missing, but I just find that interesting. Remote viewing plus Bigfoot. So maybe someone's trying to remote view and capture evidence of Bigfoot somehow. This is cute. Reasons to befriend a spirit. Reasons to befriend a spirit. And then this next one is spelled out all in one word, but it says befriend a nerd. Befriend a nerd. I have a blog post about something like reasons why you should befriend a paranerd today or something like that. Do they ever return to possess the living? I don't know. I certainly hope not for some of you. How to talk to spirits through clock radios. It's been a long time since I've tried, but I had a few experiences with the clock radio. That also involved a dream where I dreamed about an old clock radio that I grew up with that was still at my parents' house. And in the dream, I communicated with the spirit through the clock radio. And so I actually own that clock radio now. And I a couple years ago, I tried several experiments with it. And I don't think I ever really got much out of it. But so I have several blog posts about that. And so apparently other people try to do the same thing with old clock radios. How to help a grieving pet parent. Aww. Using balloons on ancestral altars. That is interesting. I think maybe I can picture what they're going for here, but apparently they're wanting some ideas for that. What is a spiritual shift? And I thought that was funny because it drives me nuts. Every episode that gets me going into talking about my spiritual shift in every episode. And I think sometimes I talk about it too much, but I thought it was funny that someone Googled, what is a spiritual shift? Seeing an apparition of my father. Common signs of the spirit of the loved one's visitation. So again, it's kind of cool. Maybe people are experiencing these things and then looking for answers, Googling the terms. There's several things about Halloween that brought people to the website. How do Victorians celebrate Halloween? Oh, well, that I can talk about this one all day. So I want to be friends with the person who searched this. Let's chat. Let's talk. Another one is ideas for outdoor Halloween spirit seance. And man, does that give me an idea for next year Halloween. Ideas for outdoor Halloween spirit seance. That would be so very cool. Did people decorate for Halloween in the 70s? And this one just makes me think, am I that old now that younger people aren't really sure if we celebrated Halloween in the 70s or decorated? I guess maybe to some people that seems like forever ago. But yes, we did decorate. In fact, I have some of the reprints of some of those those decorations that a lot of people used in the 70s. But yeah, Halloween decorations go way back. All right, here we go. Paranormal acronyms. And oh, there are many. How many can you think of? Quick, how many paranormal acronyms can you think of? Okay. EMF, EVP, ITC, SPR, kind of, I don't know if that counts, PK, psychokinesis. Did you come up with some more? Anyway, there's lots of them. That's funny. This next one I totally don't get, but I'm just putting it in here because it was funny. Phono, like PHONO. Phono Big Mama. And apparently the big in there was enough to get people to bigseance.com. Hope I helped you and hope you found what you were looking for at bigseance.com. Phono Big Mama. Nice. Here's a good one. Audio pareidolia. I love it when I see proper search terms, and this one is always a pet peeve of mine. There are even some really big people in the paranormal world on TV and in some podcasts who pronounce it incorrectly, and very often they pronounce it pareidolia or pareidelia, and this just drives me nuts. Anyway, this is the audio form of what is more often referred to as matrixing. You know, when your mind makes something out of randomness. And it's not always a ghost. I think most of the time it's not. It's just what your mind decides to do with nothing. Decorating for a seance. Again, here's this decorating thing. I love it. Psychics as good as Linda Salvin. I put this in the Big Seance parlor just recently when I found this one, and I hope Linda Salvin gets a kick out of it. Linda Salvin has been on the show. She's a previous guest, and she's apparently a really good psychic. So someone is looking for psychics as good as Linda Salvin. Spirits calling on the phone. And this is a thing. There are books out there that you can read about phone calls from the dead, and most of them are a little older, but nowadays people are even reporting text messages from the dead and voicemails from the dead. But yes, spirits apparently have been calling people on the phone for years. Is Lafayette County Courthouse haunted? And I can only assume and draw conclusions that they're talking about the Lafayette County Courthouse that was in or is in the town that I grew up in, Lafayette County, Missouri. It's one of the oldest courthouses still in use today. And it just makes me wonder. It's always been a mysterious building to me. I've only been in it a few times, but it was when I was a kid. I don't really know too much about the inside of it. Lexington, Missouri, that's where it is. There was a Civil War battle there, lots of history. And so makes me wonder, is Lafayette County Courthouse haunted? You might have to look that one up. It's a pretty cool building. And lastly, Lady Gaga, astral travel. And I'm only assuming that this took people to a post that I wrote a couple of years ago after having a dream where Lady Gaga came to my house and wanted to just hang out. And I'm sure there was more to that dream. But apparently someone else is astral traveling with Lady Gaga, or at least trying to. I think that's funny. And of course, just like last year, and I think the year before, the number one search term, there are, I can't tell you how many times people searched it, but something very close to I can read in my dreams, which then, of course, takes people to the all-time most popular post at bigseance.com. It's not even a podcast episode, but it's the blog post, Reading in Your Dreams. And so that's still another year, the top search term. Well, I hope that was interesting to you. I hope it wasn't too boring. It's definitely a little different. It's not the typical interview. And it's just me hanging out here, being nerdy, chilling out in my blanket with some coffee and, enjoying the second day of January 2017 as I record this. So let's take a break and see what Tim Prossel has for us in another episode of the Spectral Edition. And when we come back, I'll have 9 tips to keep the paranormal alive throughout the winter. Here's Tim.
Welcome to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prossel. Now, while I would be hesitant to be the owner of a haunted house, I find it very inviting to spend the night in a haunted hotel room. You get the thrill of possibly running into a ghost without any of the responsibilities you can leave the next day. I've got a ghost report here, which is about a haunted hotel room. It was printed in the Evening Bulletin from Maysville, Kentucky on January 25th of 1889. The headline is Preller's Ghost, said to be haunting the Southern Hotel St. Louis. And before I begin this, let me point out that a drummer in 1889 referred to a traveling salesman. St. Louis, January 25th. The tragedy enacted on April 5, 1885 in room 144 of the Southern Hotel is revived by the strange experience of the guests who have recently occupied the apartment. It was in room 144 that Maxwell chloroformed Preller to death, robbed the remains, and then packed them in a trunk. The room was not occupied for many months afterward, and such a horror was developed in the traveling public's mind that the hotel found it impossible to utilize the room, and in order to remove any ghastly dread of 144, the number was changed to 133. The nerves of several drummers were first tested, and only 2 exhibited signs of a collapse the next morning. The experience of one guest was told Monday. The gentleman is a prominent commercial traveler of well-balanced mind, sound intellect, and good, broad common sense. This is his remarkable story given in his own language.
I knew nothing at all about the room when I took it. In fact, the Maxwell Preller incident had wholly escaped me. I went to bed at my usual hour and was awakened with a start by hearing a strange tapping against the head of the bed. Tap, tap, tap was the order in which they came, 1 disconnected tap and then 2 in quick succession. I was aroused in an instant, but heard nothing more and concluded the tapping was caused by the cracking of the glue. The same tapping occurred several other times during the night, but I dismissed it on the comfortable theory I have just mentioned. The next evening I noticed that the drawers of the bureau would always open, however often I closed them. I pushed them in whenever I passed near the bureau, but they would invariably open again as though forced out by some unseen agency. Still, I was not alarmed. The most startling occurrence, and the one which finally decided me to leave the room, came on the 3rd night. I had noticed that the chambermaid had entirely cleared the hearth of debris, and not so much as a scrap of paper was left in it. I was thrown from deep slumber into absolute wakefulness around 1 o'clock by an explosion on the hearth that sounded like the explosion of a big firecracker. I was scared, you can bet. A second explosion, a little louder, followed, and then came a third, which capped the climax. It was terribly violent, and the detonation was fearful. I arose, dressed, lighted the gas, and looked at the hearth. It was completely filled with a slaty substance that looked like ore of some kind, and one of the large cubes that made up the mass was torn from the brickwork or tiling. Pieces of slate were thrown across the room. I went downstairs and told the night clerk to come right up to the room and see what had happened. He refused with a sickly smile. I returned to the room, passed a sleepless night, and changed my room the next day. I then learned from a friend the history of the room, and 1 or 2 things that hitherto had been inexplicable to me then became painfully clear. I noticed the bellboys would get out of the room as quickly as they could, not waiting for the occasional tip which I held to them, nor could I get an answer when I rang the bell after 10 o'clock at night. I found out that at that hour the lights in the hall were turned out, and the bellboys would not go through the corridor after that time at any price. I give these facts for what they are worth, without comment or explanation. I am not a spiritualist or a believer in their doctrines. I was absolutely sober, too, as I seldom take a drink.
The manager of the hotel, Mr. Lewis, had nothing to say when the story was told him, nor could he suggest any explanation. You can do a little bit of Googling on the Southern Hotel in St. Louis, and you'll find out that it was a luxury hotel. The first Southern Hotel in St. Louis was built in 1866, but that one burnt down in 1877. So this story must have taken place in the second Southern Hotel, which was closed in 1912 and then demolished in 1933. You've been listening to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prossel. I have close to 300 of these ghost reports, and I post one each Wednesday on my website, The Merry Ghost Hunter, MERRY Ghost Hunter. You can also find previously released audio versions of Spectral Edition there. That's The Merry Ghost Hunter. I hope you stop by.
You're listening to the Big Seance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out BigSeance.com for more discussion.
Thank you, Tim. On January 8th, 2015, about 2 years ago, I created a podcast episode called 9 Tips to Keep the Paranormal Alive in Your Life Throughout the Winter. And in the last week, as I've been struggling to kind of get inspired to do anything or podcast, I thought maybe this could be helpful for me too. Maybe other people, in these early days of January need some inspiration to keep the paranormal alive. So here were those tips. There were 9, and I'm just going to briefly kind of go through them. Tip number 1 was find a good book on a paranormal, spiritual, or metaphysical topic, or even just a good ghost story. And you know what? I gave some recommendations in this podcast episode, but I think I'd like to recommend a book that I'm in the middle of right now. I'm about halfway through it, so this will be an updated recommendation. And it's Our Unseen Guest by Darby and Joan. It's a book from 1920. And I think I've heard people say that you can actually find it free online, like in a PDF. But I, of course, always love the vintage Dead Tree version. But that's a book that I'd recommend. Tip number 2 is plan and hold a seance with a small group of friends. Definitely. How fun does that sound? Light some candles, man. Tip number 3, consider reading a how-to book on something like channeling, meditation, Ouija, tarot, astral travel, EVP, or another equally interesting topic. And then you can give those things a try. I also have an episode of the Big Seance podcast that gives tips on how to record EVP, if that interests you. Tip number 4, find a cozy place to stay for the weekend. It doesn't even have to be haunted. It certainly helps if the place has some interesting history to it, or maybe it just looks haunted. Find a bed and breakfast somewhere. Cute little hotel. That would be fun. Tip number 5, watch an old black and white spooky movie, or 2 or 3. Again, I gave some suggestions, and those suggestions were either The Uninvited, which we talked about just a few minutes ago, movie from 1944, or The Innocents from 1961. Both good movies. Love them. Tip number 6 was start an interesting or vintage collection, perhaps one that causes you to dig into some history or genealogy. Tip number 7, visit an old cemetery with a camera, especially after a pretty snow. Well, we haven't had much snow here, or really any snow here in my city, I don't think, and so we just need some. And then it's definitely time for me to go out and find a cemetery. I haven't done that in a while. Tip number 8, start a grave adoption project. If you listen to episode number 11 from September 4th, 2014, I suggested that listeners consider starting a new fall tradition of adopting graves. And I only did that for 2 years. It's a lot of work, but I definitely got a lot out of that, and I enjoyed that, and maybe I'll do that again sometime. And lastly, tip number 9, invite a paranormal investigation team into your home, find a trusted team, or a friend's home, and convince them to let you help investigate. If that sounds like fun, why not? I don't think there's any harm in that. Well, folks, I'm glad you humored me and, just listened to me blab away for this episode. We'll be getting back on track. Our next guest, I won't tell you who it is because the interview hasn't happened yet, but it's scheduled. But our next guest was actually recommended by several of you in the last year. So I'm excited for the next episode. I hope you have a great beginning to your 2017, and I hope you have a good week. And so I'll see you next time. Bye, Paranerds. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit BigSeance.com. Just click on the Big Seance podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, TuneIn Radio, and iHeartRadio. Do you have any comments or feedback? Go to BigSeance.com/feedback to learn how to get your voice in a future show. Or you can call my feedback line, 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. Interested in learning how to promote and share the podcast? Go to BigSeance.com/share. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.